Erin Kennedy here today with Evan New. We're doing Tech Teardown for Tuesday, February 25th. The Mobile World Congress, the biggest mobile device trade show in the world, kicked off this week in Barcelona, Spain. Smartphone investors are seeing a stream of news coming out of MWC. Let's start with Nokia, who now announced its long-rumored Android phone. Tell us more about this.
That's right. So they announced 3 low-cost phones. They're running a heavily forked version of Android, pretty much what people expected. The Nokia X, X Plus, and XL. These devices are priced between 89 and 109 euros, which is about 120, 150 bucks. They're not targeting the U.S. market, but at these price points, we're obviously talking about kind of low-end phones with really low-end hardware specs. Nothing going to be kind of crazy as far as the hardware is concerned. The real story here is that it's Android. It's been forked. The interface is completely new and different. It looks very, very similar to Windows Phone, so shares some similarities with the interface to its Lumia lineup, even though it's still a different operating system.
So if it's so similar to Windows Phone, then what's the point of Nokia doing an Android phone to begin with?
Well, the key here is to get app availability, which is really why most people try to piggyback off Android, like we've seen in the past. Windows Phone has been growing its app count in total, but it's kind of hit the ceiling at around 200,000. Like most forked Android devices. This will not have Google's blessing, will not have Google Play, no Gmail, no Chrome, no Google Maps. So Nokia is actually going to be starting its own third-party store where it'll ask developers to bring its apps over with very minimal effort, very much like what Amazon does with the Kindle Fire, operating its own distinct Android app store, and developers just bringing stuff over.
Does that concern you though? Because historically, it's been difficult for companies to make their homegrown app stores happen. Like if you look at Microsoft's Windows Phone platform, it's not even comparable to like
It's tough, and specifically with these Android companies, or the companies that try to piggyback off Android, it's very difficult because developers always, if they have Android apps, they update in Google Play first, and then it kind of slowly trickles down and filters to all these different third-party. And the more third-party app stores you have, the more more layers of it that the developers have to go through. The biggest example of a different example is Blackberry, which they added Android support in Blackberry 10 to a very different route where developers had to port over, and they had an Android emulator running inside of Blackberry 10 as opposed to the actual device running on Android. That failed pretty badly. But again, it was just another example of a company trying to piggyback off Android's success, shortcut to this big app count. But it's a very tough strategy to actually pull off successfully.
Well, so isn't this kind of awkward for Microsoft, given that they're going to be closing soon on their acquisition of Nokia's devices and services? Like, what does this mean? It's
definitely very awkward. I'm sure there have been a lot of awkward conversations between the two of them, but it's definitely pushing, Nokia X is definitely pushing Microsoft services. So things like OneDrive, Outlook, Skype, Bing, all that good stuff. But it's kind of trying to straddle this line between wanting to offer the number of Android apps, but also push people towards Microsoft services. And you're right that in a sense it is counterproductive to Microsoft's broader Windows Phone ambitions, because they would certainly prefer Windows Phone to be its own a platform to succeed on its own right and its own merits, and as well as their services. They don't want to have to rely on something like this. But for Nokia, I think it's just more of an experimental hedge of like trying to diversify beyond Windows Phone, knowing there is a lot of interest, especially in the low-end markets, for Android. Microsoft, the timing is just weird because, this phone has been in development for a long time.
So they couldn't kill it now?
And I think the timing has just worked out to where they happen to launch within weeks of them expecting to close this deal. And, there were questions now, is like, I honestly wouldn't be too surprised if Microsoft ends up killing it. But, at this point, it's like, let it go and see what it does. But it's just a really weird thing, because what if this really takes off and becomes a really big driver?
That's super embarrassing.
Yeah, it would be. But who knows? But if these phones have meaningful user inflows to Windows services in these emerging markets, that's a pretty big win for Microsoft. But if the compromise is we have to use Android as part of it, it's very weird strategically. But I have to wait and see. I wouldn't be surprised if they kill it, but maybe it takes off and maybe they keep it. Who knows?
Samsung also took to the stage to unveil its latest and greatest flagship phone, the Galaxy S5. The previous Galaxy S4 had a strong launch, but demand quickly tapered off. Do you think this is going to help Samsung reinvigorate its high-end sales? So
this might surprise you a little bit, but Samsung has decided to copy Apple a little bit here.
No.
You better believe it.
Yeah,
it's true. So they added a fingerprint sensor, after Apple did their Touch ID fingerprint scanner in the 5S. But yeah, Samsung has kind of followed the same route. Added for right near the home button for biometric security, and it's a very different approach. So you have to swipe it as opposed to Apple's, which you kind of just push your finger on it and it works. They also made device bigger, another shocker for Samsung. They had 5.1-inch display.
Is that like phablet territory yet? 5.1 inch?
I think 5.
Fondly,
For me, I mean, there's no like hard and fast rule, but my perception is 5 inches and above is kind of like that phablet territory, or maybe phone-blit if you go by Samsung's terms. But I think that last year with the Galaxy S4, Samsung kind of shot itself in the foot because they marketed the Galaxy S4 so much and they built up so much hype around this device. And when it was eventually unveiled, I think people were a little bit disappointed that it wasn't like this. It doesn't change the world because that's how
they hyped it quite a lot. And I remember the marketing was basically like, this is a great phone if you like to eat messy food or ribs or something.
And just like, the event that they had, like this Broadway show, I mean, it was it was a massive marketing campaign. And I think this time they took a little bit more of a muted approach, which is in line with their previous statements that they're going to kind of tone down their marketing and make it more efficient because you can't blow all this money forever. So I think they kind of realized that. But also, it kind of kept people's expectations in check. And this phone is very much just a refinement, evolution of the same formula that they used in the Galaxy S4, but without as much marketing behind it. I mean, certainly they're going to still market the hell out of this thing. But at the same time, I don't think that people are as disappointed. So I think that, they're also preempting Apple in some of these ways by incorporating a lot of health and fitness applications, which is something they started last year. But we've also been hearing a lot of rumors about Apple doing a lot of biometrics, health, and fitness, and whatever they're doing this year. So, I think that they could kind of, it will probably help them reinvigorate a little bit of demand on their flagship lineup.
Well, so regarding the Touch ID sensor on Apple's 5S, that was a key selling point. Do you think that's going to turn out the same way for Samsung? How does their equivalent work?
It doesn't seem like the reports that I'm seeing in the hands-on are not very favorable of it. If you also remember the HTC, a little while ago after the iPhone 5S launched, HTC launched one Max that had a fingerprint sensor on the back, again with this kind of swiping mechanism. But I think that these more traditional sensors don't work as well, in part because not only did Apple put all this money into buying Authentech to actually integrate it, and they spent $350 million on this acquisition that they could use to integrate deeply into the phone, whereas these other companies are just kind of like taking these more traditional sensors and just putting it on there and hoping it gets the job done well enough. But the end experience isn't as well. The same thing with the One Max. People just thought it didn't work well. It doesn't register very well. And I think that's going to be kind of the same story with the Galaxy S5.
So Samsung remains the top smartphone original equipment manufacturer by volume in the world. Do you see this phone helping Samsung to defend its throne? I
think the GS5 will probably allow Samsung to maintain the current kind of competitive dynamic where, in the high end at least, where it primarily competes with Apple. As we know, most of its unit growth nowadays is coming from the low ends where it's competing in emerging markets, and the vast majority of their operating profits are still coming from this handset division. So I think that it will probably keep them where they're at. But again, when you're kind of operating at the levels that Samsung is with unit volumes, much like Apple, it's kind of hard to see them really growing units in the same way that they have been over the past few years. But I think it'll kind of help them keep their stance.
Blackberry may be down, but it's not out. The struggling smartphone maker also announced a pair of Blackberry 10 devices at MWC. Tell us a little bit about this.
So if you remember in December, BlackBerry said it was canceling 2 devices that were in the pipeline for fear of poor sales and all the inventory risk associated with that. And as well, kind of just an indication that they're going towards more of a leaner product portfolio. So these 2 phones are going to be part of the newest lineup. They're mid-range phones, the Q20 and the Z3. Q20 is a QWERTY model, very much like the Q10 before it. The big difference this time is that they're bringing back the trackpad and some of the other physical buttons that are really popular among their user base, which like hardware buttons and keys, and kind of going back to more or less a previous design language. The Z3 is a touchscreen phone, just like the Z10. The Z3 is notable because it's the first phone to come out of BlackBerry's new partnership with Foxconn, where Foxconn, really handles a lot of the heavy lifting behind the scenes in terms of inventory management and manufacturing. So I think that that's actually very good for BlackBerry to kind of outsource those functions to someone that's a little bit better at it.
So BlackBerry is still pushing ahead with BB10. What do you think about this?
I think it's safe to say that at this point that BlackBerry 10 has been more or less a failure. Those years of delays certainly didn't help, but on the consumer end of it, consumers have made it pretty clear that they're not really interested in these devices. Last quarter they sold 75% of their sell-through was BlackBerry 7 devices. So we're only talking about 1.3 million BlackBerry 10 devices that they sold, which is pretty meaningless in the grand scheme of the smartphone market, which hit $1 billion last year, full year. But they also took a big charge on the Blackberry 10 device last quarter on the Z10. So I mean, I don't expect them to give up on Blackberry 10. I mean, that's just too much of a concession to make. But at the same time, I think they should really focus on the more promising aspects of their turnaround.
Well, so you think that's too much of a concession to make, but what do you think is the most meaningful part of their turnaround story?
I think it's always been about, for me, BlackBerry's turnaround is more about enterprise security software and mobile device management. And they actually announced something around this too at Mobile World Congress. They announced BlackBerry Enterprise Service 12, so BES 12, really kind of streamlines their MDM platform. Because before they had two platforms that enterprise companies that want to use their software have to have two different systems in place for, depending on if you have BlackBerry 7 devices, BlackBerry 10 devices, Windows Phone, iOS, and it's very complicated. Whereas BES 12, it kind of consolidates all that under one offering that can support all of these devices. It's also a much more simplified pricing structure. So I think that is really much more promising to me in the long term as an actual business. And there's a lot of competition in this space too. So I think one of the worst things they could do is that they start making mistakes on the enterprise software side if they're focusing too heavily on the devices and this BBM messaging stuff.
So you think enterprise software is BlackBerry's way out?
I think that's the most promising aspect of the four things that they're trying to go after. But I mean, I know shares have been up the past couple of days after this Facebook WhatsApp deal and all this talk about BBM.
Everyone thinks BBM is going to be the next
I mean, I know that, and the CEO, John Chen, was all saying like he would consider selling BBM. And there's certainly some value in there, but I don't think it's warranted. I mean, shares are up 10% today, plus they were up like 9 or 10% yesterday. I think there's just too much over the past couple of days on this BBM story. And I mean, there's definitely some value there, but I think it's getting a little bit ahead of itself.
All right. Number 4 wireless carrier T-Mobile has reported earnings, and the Un-carrier continues to make progress with shaking up the domestic wireless industry. What's the news here? So
they added about 1 million branded customers last quarter, bringing their full-year customer additions to 4.4 million, which is a pretty solid year for them compared to how they were doing historically before. Total customer base is now around 47 million. Their aggression in marketing and pricing is really paying off, and they're winning back these customers in a big way, as you can see from these numbers. But these strategies do come at a cost, and their net loss did widen to about $20 million, which is about 3 cents per share. So I think that might be why investors are disappointed because shares are down on the earnings.
Does the aggressive price cutting, does it concern you that it's weighing on the bottom line, or do you think this is a long-term strategy?
It's kind of a give and take. I mean, so branded postpaid average revenue per user did fall 3% sequentially because customers are shifting to these new value and simple choice plans that T-Mobile has really kind of rallied around. Adjusted EBITDA fell 8% sequentially, which is kind of a lot considering a quarter-to-quarter decline there. And most of that has really been driven by this heavy promotional spending. On top of that, they're also ramping up capital spending in the coming year. So last year they spent $4.2 billion on capital expenditures. That's expected to be $4.3 to $4.6 billion this year. So, I mean, they're spending a lot of money on a lot of places. But on the CapEx side of it, they're definitely getting something for that because actually there's a third-party report recently released from OpenSignal saying that T-Mobile now has the nation's fastest LTE network on average. So that's a pretty nice little win there.
How does the Metro PCS integration coming along?
The integration is actually coming along ahead of schedule. So right now, 25% of Metro PCS's spectrum has been refarmed and reintegrated into T-Mobile's new network. So that's a pretty nice portion of their spectrum that they're being able to use now. The cost-saving synergies are also coming in a lot better than expected. For example, the original capital expenditure synergies were estimated at this neighborhood of 70 million to 135 million, and T-Mobile now says those are up to like almost 700 million. So I mean, that's a pretty nice, much better than expected win there. The company has also been kind of selling these T-Mobile compatible devices to Metro PCS customers to kind of pave the way for this inevitable transition to shut down the Metro PCS network, but then your customers can already just use your new network. So I think a lot of pieces are coming together, spending a lot of money, but I think eventually it will pay off.
All right. It's official. LinkedIn has announced that it's launching in China. This is a really big step, isn't it, for the professional social network? I mean, come on, it's China.
I think so. And we've talked about this before, but yeah, I think it's definitely nice that it's official now. And the company says that they've been thinking about this for upwards of 2 years and just trying to figure out the right way to move into China. So they've been hiring executives as well to kind of prepare for all these different things to put together this broader strategy. They have about 4 million users in China right now, and that's on the English side. But since that's always been about Chinese professionals that are bilingual, that's kind of about Chinese people reaching out to other parts of the world. Whereas now they're launching a Chinese site, and then LinkedIn can really come in here and make an impact within the company and help do all the things that LinkedIn does within China. It's a very, very large professional user base.
So several tech companies have had problems in China because of the Chinese government's pretty pervasive censorship. How do you think LinkedIn's going to handle this?
It's definitely the key challenge that they're going to face, and they're very aware of it, and they're really trying to get ahead of it and be very, very upfront and transparent about how they're going to approach it, because it is kind of a fact of life if you're going to go compete over there. And I mean, there are a lot of local companies that are already popping up. For example, TNG has about 17 million users right now, and it has to catch up to these kind of local players that have this head start, that are willing to play ball with the government rules. And I mean, no one wants to censor their users. As far as no U.S. company wants to censor the user, but LinkedIn has this opportunity here that they're the only company that can really get in here into China in a meaningful way compared to Google or Facebook or Twitter, who have all had problems with the Chinese government in the past, or they're either blocked by it or just hate the censorship and don't want to deal with it.
Right.
And I mean, I think that the big difference for LinkedIn, and one that the company CEO Jeff Weiner pointed out, was that the company's goals are actually aligned with the government here, because both want to just provide economic opportunities to this growing middle class, which is something that isn't necessarily true for these other companies. Like Facebook just wants to sell ads,
right?
And the government doesn't care if you want to sell ads to their people.
Post pictures of your baby.
Right, whereas if you're helping the people grow economically,
right.
I mean, that's a pretty tangible benefit the government can support in a big way.
So you mentioned the growing middle class. Everyone knows China's got a pretty populous country. So what kind of opportunity for LinkedIn are we talking about here?
So LinkedIn estimates that there are 140 million Chinese professionals that it can potentially access. Even if it gets half of that, that's a pretty big win off of its current user base of about 280 million. So I think this is definitely an opportunity that's worth going after. I mean, the censorship thing is a really hard thing to kind of navigate with, philosophical beliefs and, and abiding by government regulations. I mean, they've applied for a license to operate and they're just waiting to get it approved now. But overall, I think it's definitely worth going after, and especially when you're the only one that can actually do it.
All right. That's all for today on Tech Teardown. For Evan New, I'm Erin Kennedy, and we'll see you next time.